Welcome back to In the Trenches. I am Garrett Schwartz. With me is Jeff Dubrov, and we are joined by a very special guest today, Richard Deitsch, a writer and reporter with Sports Illustrated. He writes the SI Media column. He also hosts the SI Media podcast. I highly recommend subscribing. Basically, he does a series of podcasts each week of one-on-one interviews, most recently with Jim Nantz and Katie Nolan, who now works with with ESPN. He also does a series of roundtable discussions talking about topics like NFL ratings and people who are under 30 who are looking to break into the sports media industry, which we will touch on in a little bit. But Richard, the main reason Jeff and I wanted to have you on was to talk about the Pac-12 and its commissioner, Larry Scott. Jeff and I have been very critical of the Pac-12 conference. And before we get into any of the specific grievances, we wanted to ask you, what is the overall kind of general perception of the Pac-12 conference in the sports and sports media industries, and maybe ranked up against the other Power 5 conferences? And actually, before you answer the question, I wanted to thank you again for joining us.
Well, good to be here, Garrett. First of all, why is the show In the Trenches, Garrett? Is that your title, or what is that the name of the show, and you guys are just the new hosts of the show?
So Jeff and I started the show a few years ago, and Jeff and I tend to disagree quite a bit, and
more than quite a bit.
And the main focus of our podcast is USC football and USC sports, and we just thought In the Trenches, kind of has the good vibe of football and roughing it out and battling on air. So yeah, we picked that name.
All right. Well, I mean, the other thing, Garrett, is I admire how you've struggled so hard in that Southern California sunshine attending USC. So props to you for somehow being able to get through like the tough winters of 55 degrees and such. So,
hey, those first few games of the season are actually brutally hot. It's not so easy to sit in the Coliseum at 100 degrees temperatures.
That's true. I admire the courage that you pulled off for that.
Thank you. So going back to the question, what is the overall perception of the Pac-12, by the big players in media and sports media, and how do you think the Pac-12 stacks up, in terms of popularity or prestige among the other Power 5 conferences?
Well, I mean, I think this is more of a sort of a perception question, and I think a lot of how you would determine what the perception is probably how big a college sports fan you are, where you live in the country. So there's a lot of variables there. That said, I think you'd have to probably look at it sport by sport. And I think people obviously think in terms of the major sports, college football, college basketball, I think if you're a sports fan, I think you think the Pac-12 is a legitimate Power 5 conference. Obviously, it doesn't have the same kind of cachet in football as the SEC or the Big Ten, but, it's still a legitimate conference that, if things break right, always should have a team near the top of that conference with a chance for a national championship. Basketball obviously is a little bit trickier, but, again, sort of the same premise. There are probably college basketball conferences top to bottom, certainly in the women's game, that the women's game Pac-12 is really, really strong. Maybe there's other men's conferences that are a little bit better. But I think reputationally in those sports, I think the reputation is pretty good. You have to keep in mind that so much of like what conference is quote unquote hot, so to speak, is often so determined by like who wins the biggest title. So Alabama wins, and people are like SEC football is number one, or it's hot. It's not exactly always the parallel, but you get the benefit of that if your conference wins a title. But you go down the list in terms of the Pac-12, and you go to some of the quote-unquote minor sports or niche sports, the conference is always a powerhouse. And you guys should probably not forget that. Some of these sports might not be televised the way the big sports are, but whether it's volleyball, track and field, Pac-12 is always sort of a top high tier, top kind of 3 or 4 conference when it comes to that stuff. So, I would not. I'm speaking from somebody who lives in New York, so I'm very, very far away from where you guys are in LA and very far away from the West Coast. But the Pac-12 network doesn't have some kind of damaged reputation compared to the other Power 5 conferences. I just think there are certain conferences that when you think of certain sports, immediately that conference is going to come to mind. And because of Alabama's dominance in particular, I think when it comes to football, people are always going to think SEC first, and then probably Big Ten second, just because of the coaches in that conference.
really interesting, Richard. You bring up a good point about the smaller niche sports for the Pac-12. I mean, USC water polo, men's water polo has been to a national championship game against either Cal or UCLA 8 straight seasons. So, I mean, the big money sports are where lately, at least, we've seen, especially from a USC perspective, not having a Pac-12 team in the playoff except for Oregon 2 years back. But I want to ask a question, again, related to the...
Listen, I realize, you guys are in the middle of it and you're in the thick of it. I understand that. 2 years back, that's not, we're not talking about the Bills never winning a Super Bowl. You know what I mean? Like 2 years back, that's still fairly recent history that Oregon team had a chance to win a national title. Now, admittedly, they got beat pretty big, but they were still in the final game, which always speaks to usually the strength, at least at the top end of a conference.
Yeah, but we are also coming off a season in which the Pac-12 champion, who was, again, 3-loss USC, wasn't even remotely in the playoff conversation.
Correct, yeah. I was just going to say, I agreed. This is you would have this better than me. As I'm talking to you guys, I'll try to look up the football standings. But this was for the all right, so here, now I have it here. Yeah, I mean, you look at some of the power teams historically. Stanford, 9-5 overall, right? Lost their bowl game to TCU. USC, 11-3, lost their bowl game to Ohio State. Arizona State, 7-6. Arizona, 7-6, crushed in the bowl.
Oh no, it was a horrendous bowl season for the Pac-12.
I agree with you. It's a down, and Oregon, which has been, essentially over the last decade, a power team. 7-6 this year, and then they lose in their bowl game. So I'm, in terms of this year. You're right. The Pac-12 did not have a good year in football, and there are better people than me, the Bruce Feldman types, who would do this. But like off the top of my head, it seems like they're either the number 4 or the number 5 of the Power 5 conferences this year.
And yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It was a bad bowl season overall, and it's bad when your conference champion loses the way that USC did. But back to that Pac-12 title game, and and that game's on a Friday night. It was the only game on that Friday night, yet out of the Power 5 conference championship games, it comes in dead last in the ratings. When it comes to putting that game on a Friday night, is this a bad business decision from Pac-12 Commissioner Larry Scott, or do you think he's compensating for the fact that he knows if he puts it on Saturday, it's going to be dead last either way?
All right, so remind me again, who was in the final? USC versus who?
The Pac-12 title game was USC against Stanford in San Francisco Levi Stadium. And I think what Jeffrey's basically going at is, look, the USC and the Pac-12 wasn't necessarily the most prestigious, talented conference in football. That being said, we don't believe that Larry Scott is positioning the conference in USC to be on the platform that it so deserves. So essentially, the Pac-12 Conference Championship game was the only conference championship game this year, which was played on a Friday. The other 4 Power 5 conferences played their game on a Saturday. What was the rationale?
Again, I have to sort of look at the contract, but, I guess that sort of the theory is you're trying to own a day of the week away from all the other conference finals, which is a Friday. But here's what I would say to that. I don't remember the rating. You guys can remind me of that. But part of the reason that rating was down is probably twofold. One, these are not the best USC and Stanford teams of all time. So you don't have the kind of fervor nationally for that game. And when it comes to the Pac-12 in particular, you have to have teams that have either a star player or a Heisman type of player or an unbelievable record, an undefeated record going into the championship game to draw the casual to mid-heavy college football fan on the East Coast. Because think about the commitment. The commitment is I have to stay up late to watch the conclusion of that game. Now, if it's like Christian McCaffrey type, who's like got a chance for a Heisman, or USC has Sam Darnold, who I think is potentially going to go to my team and have a high pick. Well, I might make that investment. If it's just sort of a USC team with multiple losses that is not going to be a title contender, if it's a Stanford team that's down like it was, I'm not surprised at that rating. I would just tell you guys that a lot of this is cyclical, and you're not so far removed from great Stanford teams that drew interest nationally, and you're not so far removed from great Oregon teams that drew interest nationally. And admittedly, you guys are young. We're only a decade plus removed from a USC team that was essentially like the Cavs and the Warriors, the Lionheart Bush years the ratings for those games, particularly that Texas game, I mean, through the roof. So I would just say to you guys, it is cyclical, and this year it just happened to be a very down year in that cycle. But the programs in the Pac-12, the schools are so famous, they have so many resources, they play in a big conference that I would not be surprised if 2 years from now you've got a team that's one of the Final Four playoff teams in college football.
Yeah, for the record, the Pac-12 championship game was dead last in terms of ratings compared to the other 5 conferences.
But you should go.
But I want to push back. I want to
deeper.
I want to push back.
What the number is versus those other.
It's three. USC pulled about 3.5 million. Behind the ACC. ACC was 4th at 5.5. Big 12 was 3rd at 6. And then a huge jump, the Big Ten at about 13, and the SEC was king at 13.5.
Primetime CBS, though. There are reasons for what did the Pac-12 game air on? ESPN?
ESPN.
Okay, so one, cable versus network. Network's always going to be bigger. Those other games had much better slots in terms of potential for audience. Again, I'm not Larry Scott. I'm not defending that conference. It doesn't matter to me either way. But a lot of times when it comes to viewership, you got to always keep in mind where is it viewing and what time is it viewing, and that's where the Pac-12 is always going to be against the 8 ball, because think of the percentage of the country that lives east of the Mississippi, and that's where the majority of the television homes are. You guys play in an area where the games are always going to be 3 hours against the Eastern time, so you really need a big draw to get the East Coast television homes to watch that game. That's why the Pac-12, I don't know this off the top of my head, but I bet you the last 10 years, they'd probably be closer to ranking 4th or 5th than 1st every year in those championship game viewerships.
Right, and look, this was a year in the Pac-12. I would argue that there were a lot of big storylines in that game. Obviously, you had Sam Darnold, who's a potential number 1 overall pick. You mentioned Christian McCaffrey, but don't forget Stanford's got Bryce Love, who was somewhat in that Heisman conversation.
He was a Heisman finalist.
Right, true. But again, a Heisman Trophy potential guy that really did not get any kind of traction nationally until late, right? This wasn't Lamar Jackson. This wasn't a guy who had so much hype heading into the year. And when it comes to West Coast teams, you need that to really get people on the East Coast excited about watching those games. So I would say, you guys should certainly be critical of the conference when it's due. I would just tell you, as somebody who lives in New York City, that it's always going to be a hard sell for the Pac-12 conference to get eyeballs where I am, and you're going to need something sort of special to get your average casual sports fan, be it college basketball, college football, to tune into the Pac-12. You need stars, basically, or you need star teams, and it's just very clear, at least in football, they didn't have them this year.
Had USC gone to the playoff and fulfilled those massive expectations they had coming into the season, is USC an ideal college football playoff ratings matchup? Are they a team that people from all over the country would want to tune into? And I understand it's the college football playoff, so the ratings are going to be high either way, but how would they compare to an Alabama or an Auburn, a Georgia, teams like
Ohio State, Michigan?
They're a national draw, but there are teams that are above them. So I put Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan for sure above them. Notre Dame is above them. But then I think you start thinking about USC in that next slot. So if those teams that I just named, Alabama, Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, are Tier 1, USC would be at the top of Tier 2. So they're a national draw. They're definitely a national draw if they played against any of those teams I just mentioned. And then if they're on their own trying to carry a game, they're a draw. They're just not as big a draw as those schools, and the ratings bore that out. But they're a bigger draw than like Auburn nationally, or they're a bigger draw than Kentucky, or at least in football. I don't have all the Power 5 teams ahead of me, but they're in the top 10 when it comes to viewership powered kind of teams in the Power 5 conferences.
Yeah, the Cotton Bowl was the 6th highest rated college football bowl game of the season.
Makes sense, right.
So moving on Jeffrey and I's list of grievances for the Pac-12 and its commissioner, one of the probably major flops for the conference in the last few years is the making of the Pac-12 network. And there's a handful of reasons why it has not been as successful as, say, the SEC network or the Big Ten network, which are tied to ESPN and Fox respectively. In your opinion, if you could kind of just sum up, why has the Pac-12 network, failed relatively? And do you think, the idea of, a network for the Pac-12 conference could be fixed?
Well, I'm not sure it's failed, first of all. I mean, it exists. It's got a pretty good digital footprint. It airs. The quality of the production, I think, is really, really high. So I would push back on that in terms of when I watch games. I think the quality is as good as the Big Ten Network or the SEC Network. In terms of carriage, the issue for the Pac-12 is literally what I just said. The issue is for getting viewership on some of these games. It is very hard. It is a very hard sell to get to get cable operators and/or subscribers in places that are not Pac-12 cities to pay money or pay the sports tier for the Pac-12. Now, no doubt some hardcore alums will, but as a general rule, the Big Ten Network, the SEC Network, their footprint is bigger, and it seems the interest in those conferences are greater than the Pac-12 east of the Mississippi. So if you want to compare it to those two networks, yeah, it's probably not as successful as them. But as sort of a standalone network that sort of started and is maintaining a standing, at least in terms of these conference networks, I don't think it's a bad product at all. I actually think I'm an AP women's basketball voter, so I watch a lot of Pac-12 women's basketball, and they do actually a pretty good job of carrying stuff. And I think the quality of the production is pretty good. I watched the Big Ten. I watched the SEC Network. SEC Network obviously helped by the ESPN money and production, but I don't think the Pac-12 is a bad network at all.
Yeah, I should have been.
I think you have to have realistic expectations. The Pac-12 network is never going to be, in the same conversation as FS1 or ESPN2. It's never going to have that kind of national footprint because the conference can only go so far as a national footprint.
Right, and I guess I should have been a little bit more specific because I do agree with you. At the end of the day, the Pac-12 will never stack up to the SEC in terms of a network. But from a revenue standpoint, if you are USC, it has to be very hard to look at your revenue numbers from the Pac-12 network and stack it up against those numbers, say, for like a Rutgers and the Big Ten network. And it's kind of mind-boggling, at least for me and as a USC student, to think, like, here's USC, this powerhouse brand, who's getting, nickel on the dime to what, a small school in the Big Ten like Rutgers is getting.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't know the numbers because I'm not covering the Pac-12 sort of at all as part of my coverage. Guys like John Oran and Eric Fisher at the Sports Business Daily could give you the sort of the specifics of that. But I just wonder, in terms of the money, if that's more of a product of the Big Ten is just has a bigger cable foothold, and there's just more interest in the Big Ten in terms of the larger cable universe than there is in the Pac-12. I do know, if I remember, like around 2015 or 2016, I know the Pac-12 network was in something like 90 million homes. So again, to go to have started where they started, which I think they started in 2012, if I remember right, and to be in 90 million homes in 3 or 4 years, that's pretty impressive. Again, that just means you're available in 90 million homes. Certainly, you don't have 90 million subscribers or 90 million people watching, but they've done a pretty good job, if nothing else, of in terms of the major cable providers getting the stuff on. I know they've had some issues with DirecTV. You can remind me and stuff like that, but yeah, I think they don't have a carriage deal with DirecTV, if I remember. But I think the conference has done, generally speaking, fairly well with that network because I think the quality of the network is very high, and that's what I would judge it on more as a viewer than how profitable it is. As a general enterprise, these things are going to make money. It's really just a question of how much money they make.
And yeah, Richard, we'll move on and away from the Pac-12 network, but to two players that were in the
Thank
Pac-12
God,
this
man.
year.
I've shot out all my Pac-12 network data. I'm like it's like I'm J.R. Smith, basically. I have no more jumpers to give.
Oh, man. Anyway, though, the Pac-12, and more specifically Los Angeles, I think it's safe to say had the two most popular quarterbacks, if not athletes, in all of college football this year, in Josh Rosen and Sam Darnold. Two guys
I would disagree with that.
Baker Mayfield's.
There you go. That's what I would go for. Yeah.
Anyway, let's stick with LA then. However, we hear about Josh Rosen coming out saying that he has to do 2 full-time jobs. Sam Darnold, along with being a student and an athlete, had an own podcast called Season of Sam. All these different things that college athletes, especially stars, are expected to do. Being that these athletes are unpaid, they're amateurs, does the media expect too much out of these college stars?
Absolutely, not even a question. The expectations on these guys are absurd. They're not paid, which is ridiculous, and we could have a 5-hour debate. Yeah, they got a college scholarship, blah, 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 blah. But let's face it, their time commitments are unlike any other students, and they're not, generally speaking, pushed to a lot of times what they want to study, but pushed to where they can maintain their eligibility and sort of have almost the easiest course load. So, yeah, the expectations are ridiculous. They're 19 years old, 18 years old. They're covered like professional athletes. There's a lot of pressure on them just from their coaches and the university at large. They play in front of gigantic, large crowds. There's a ton of pressure on that. In addition, obviously, to the spoils. Yeah, I think these guys are under an immense amount of pressure. I think they're not compensated for at all compared to what they can make for universities. And again, I'm not saying that it's not an incredible honor and privilege and something awesome to be part of a college football team at that level, and you obviously have a chance at the pros and all that stuff. But yeah, I think the media at large too often does not is a little how would I phrase this? Too often I find that the media, because of how often we see these players on television and because of how hard they are covered, I think we tend to forget that in chronological age just how young they are. And so I think the best people, at least in terms of television analysts, are as critical of the coaches as they are of the players. And I think the best people covering this sort of cover it with an eye towards that, you are dealing with young people. You're not dealing with professional athletes.
Yeah, and Jeff and I, still being seniors in college, it's crazy to believe that we're older than a lot of these guys who are being scrutinized by the media.
Yep, you are. Yeah.
But obviously,
I would just say this. Think about this. Think about, for you guys, if there was a reporter assigned to both of you, what would that be like? And it would shape you. It would shape who you are. It would shape sort of where you go. Again, there's a lot of positives from that. You get the benefit of the publicity, and you're in the public eye and that. But think about that. Use it and do a thought exercise, and think about what it would be like if the Los Angeles Times assigned a reporter just to cover you two.
Pretty frightening.
Yeah, think about it.
I had a quick question regarding the upcoming Olympics in South Korea. You touched on it a little bit in your most recent Roundtable podcast, but we have a handful of students here at USC at the Annenberg School of Journalism who are actually going to be leaving for about a month to intern with NBC working in South Korea. And when speaking to these students, kind of on a serious note, but also joking, obviously the politics and the tension, with North Korea and whatnot, has brought up a little bit of concern among students. So the question I had from you, speaking with people who are going to be covering the Olympics or, maybe people from NBC, is there which I'm sure there is, a concern regarding, the political climate in the region, and how do you think it's going to impact the coverage of the Olympics?
Well, I think anybody who's covering it, obviously, I've covered 7 of them, and you're always cautious heading in. Even if it's I covered the Vancouver Olympics. I mean, Canada's obviously a safe country, but you're always cautious about the security. You're always cautious about the political environment, and I think these guys will be that too. You're only 100 miles away from North Korea, so it's a fairly worrisome spot in the world. That said, a lot of times the Olympics, the worries prior to the Olympics sort of turn out to be okay during the games, and security is really tight. And you don't end up, things that you thought you'd worry about turn out not to always be the case. So I think these guys should keep their head up and pay attention to their surroundings, obviously follow all the protocol that they've been told prior to going. But I think generally speaking, I think these Olympics will come off fine. Politically, it was a very important thing that South Korea and North Korea are going to walk into the stadium as a unified team. It's important that the North Koreans are going to compete. And that sort of provides a little bit of safety. But as a general rule, the Olympics are among the safest places on earth when they exist because the security apparatus is so great. A lot of times security experts would tell us to be more worried about places outside of the Olympics because the security at the Olympics is so great that there may be some holes in some other places in the globe because so much is concentrated on where the Olympics are. So I think it's a great opportunity. I'm glad for those students. I think you keep your head up, but as a general rule, I think they're going to be fine.
So we got one more question, and we wanted to touch on, again, the podcast you did about a week ago now on people who are under 30 or maybe graduating college, like Jeff and I, who are looking to enter the sports media field. And we had two questions on this topic. The first being that in your conversation, some of the figures mentioned that people looking to enter the industry, there's kind of a lack or less of sustainable jobs in the industry, more so than the last few years. However, one of the things that I was thinking of while listening to the podcast is at the same time, there are also a lot of jobs and opportunities that didn't necessarily exist even a few years ago. And obviously, as more and more key players in the industry like Twitter and Amazon and Facebook enter the industry, I think you're going to see more and more of these types of sports media jobs. In your opinion, from your perspective, what are one or two maybe of the most exciting opportunities in sports media, maybe that are new and up and coming, or maybe one or two jobs that you feel maybe didn't even exist a short while ago?
Well, I think basically for people your age, I think the more multimedia skills you have, the better chance you can work. So whether that's you have audio skills both on air and production, you have digital skills both being able to produce, working in CMSs as well as writing. You have video skills, being able to cut and shoot video as well as obviously being on the air. The more of those skills you have, the more potential you're going to have to be employed, because what is seemingly clear as the old world places sort of shrink a little bit, more people have to do more stuff at places, and obviously the world is going more digital than print. In terms of exciting jobs, I mean, I think what's really exciting to me would be you have the ability to create your own content, and you have the ability to come up with something without having the apparatus of like a Sports Illustrated or an ESPN. That's what's exciting. And podcasting obviously is an amazing space there, in that once you sort of master or learn the craft of being able to create a podcast and put it up, you in not so long amount of time could get a podcast that gets some significant listeners behind you. And that could be content you own, that could be content you can sell or get sponsors for. So that, I think the most exciting thing for me is just the ability for so many people, particularly people your age, to create their own products, create their own brands. That could not exist when I was graduating from school. You basically, your path had to be you had to work for some kind of organization. I got lucky. My first job out of grad school essentially was SI. But today, if I was a 23-year-old, 22-year-old, 21-year-old college student, in college, I could create my own podcast. And that podcast, maybe by the time I'm 30, could have 100,000 listeners. And if I have 100,000 listeners to my podcast, I could sell against that podcast and make some money. One of the great stories that I heard, this 23-year-old kid named Omar Raja, who founded House of Highlights, which Bleacher Report eventually bought. But the kid basically was just a huge basketball fan, and he started finding all these incredibly cool videos on Instagram, both like people doing cool stuff on the court as well as just like fun stuff in the NBA. And he basically found he put it all together, and he made a home for all this stuff. And then this big company comes along and buys the sort of the name and the premise from him after he basically was getting millions and millions and millions of views. So that's the exciting thing to me, is I think people your age could kind of create and come up with stuff and form their own sort of sports media entities, where if you were coming up in my era, you basically speaking had to work for somebody to have a shot at doing that.
We really appreciate your insight, and I think you're pretty spot on. The fact that Jeff and I get to do this show and have a guy like you agree to come on is just been incredible. So we really want to
incredible. It's not that. It's trust me. I'm not LeBron James. It's not that tough to get me.
No, I mean, we both
really
listen to you.
it.
We really appreciate you coming on. Just real finally, you do this on your show. Is there anything you'd like to say before we hang up, maybe that you'd want to share to up-and-coming people in the sports media industry? I know you just shared a lot of advice, but anything you want to add before you go?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is, and I would say this to the people that any young person that I ever deal with is, there's going to be times where it's very hard in the sports media profession, particularly the media profession. The money is not really great at the beginning. You're competing against a lot of people. Sometimes you're going to be out of work at certain times, but you just owe it to yourself to go for it. Don't take yourself out of this profession just because it's frustrating in your 20s. I would say give it a real shot. And some people will eventually leave the profession and, go into business or law school or whatever else they do in their 30s and 40s. But if you really want to be in the media, or if you really want to work in the sports media, you owe it to yourself to really give it an honest shot for a number of years. But knowing it's not going to be so easy. That would be my only advice. It's a very easy business to get discouraged because the supply far outweighs the supply far outweighs the demand. But there's something to be said about being industrious and being committed to it. And most of the people I know who've always wanted to go in the field have eventually found a place there and have found full-time employment. So that would be the one thing I would leave people with, is just when things get discouraged, especially if you are in your 20s, don't give up. You owe it to yourself when you're young to go for it. You'll have a lot of time later on if you ultimately want to switch your career.
We really appreciate that advice. I know as Jeff and I are looking for jobs in the industry, it could be a little daunting at times, but nonetheless, as of now, we're doing what we love. We're trying to do what we love. Anyway,
awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Writer and reporter for Sports Illustrated, writer for the SI Media column, and host of the SI Media podcast. Highly recommend subscribing. We'll be back in just a few on In the Trenches on this Tuesday evening.